So when she was about 3, she would always say, I don't want to grow up. I always want to stay a kid. Now she's 5. She says, I figured out how I'm going to stay a kid. I said, oh, you have? How are you going to do that, Jackie? She goes, I'm going to die young. Yeah. I looked at my wife. I was so angry. I said, what did you tell her? She didn't know about her diagnosis. She just thought she was sick. And she goes, honey, I didn't tell her anything. God showed her that.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode. I have not had a guest on in quite some time, and I'm so excited for our guest today. I am joined here by Dave Page, and I met Dave probably almost 2 years ago at a grief recovery certification training, but he has such an incredible story. He does such amazing work. And even though he came into the training, he really already has a heart for healing and has worked in the grief space a lot. And so I was excited when he could join. So thank you for joining, Dave. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you, Sandi. I'm excited too.
Absolutely. Well, Dave, if you can just take a few moments, tell us what you do and what areas that your heart is bent toward.
Yeah, so I'm currently the care director at Shepherd Church in Porter Ranch, California, in Southern California. Love doing that. It's a big church. We have a lot of people, a lot of great work and care. And I oversee the whole care, but my main specialty is grief ministry. And that's my passion. I know, like you, our hearts are similar. My heart beats fast to help grieving people. Having gone through a major loss in my life, my daughter, my 5-year-old daughter, Jackie, unbelievable kid, died of a brain tumor very quickly. And that sent me into this world that I did not know much about. And it's just been a progression over the last 2 decades to growing into what I do now. And so I do grief work, I do workshops, I do seminars, I do grief retreats, I do grief courses, all of that just to help as many people as I can.
I so love that. And Dave, thank you for sharing about Jackie. Can you share a little bit more about like the loss itself and what happened and what that was like and how you've walked through that? Because that is such a tremendous loss.
Yeah, it was gut-wrenching, life-changing. I call it a life gate. You know, I went through that gate and my life's never been the same. I'm a man of sorrow, but I'm a man of joy too. They run along the same tracks. We always have some sorrow. We always have some joy. But we have 3 kids. I always preface it with that. I always say 2 on earth, 1 in heaven. And that is Jackie. And I was pastoring. It had been a church I started, a daughter of Saddleback Church. I was trained by Rick Warren in ministry and as a pastor. And we were up in Auburn, California, suburb of Sacramento, beautiful area by the American River. And things were going great. We were 4 years into the church. It was thriving. And then my daughter started having some symptoms. We didn't know what they were. First, she had a little bit of drool come from her mouth. Just wipe it away. Didn't affect her. Then her gait started being a little bit off. We took her in for tests at Kaiser, and they did all kinds of tests. They said, there's nothing wrong with your daughter. It's probably just a viral infection. She's fine. And I looked at her, you couldn't tell. She ran everywhere she went. She had such joy, just an amazing kid, big old smile. When she walked into the room, it would just light up the room. And so that went on for about a month and it didn't get any better. And so we took her back. They did a CAT scan. And again, they said, we can't find anything. And they finally did an MRI. And I was there. My wife was there. My wife actually went through the machine with my daughter. She was only 5. She was a little afraid to go through the machine alone. But she did. I flew down to speak at Saddleback right after the MRI. And when I landed, I got the call from my wife. And she said, honey, you better sit down. And I said, no, just tell me. And she said they found at the base of Jackie's brain. And the problem with it was the location. Part of it was enmeshed in the brain stem. So it wasn't that big, maybe about this big, but it was enmeshed in the brainstem. So I took the next plane home. We went and saw the neurologist. He showed us the x-ray. And Sandi, we asked him after he told us about where it is, it's not location. I said, what does that mean? He said, that means your daughter's going to die most likely in the next few weeks to couple months. And we were just floored, as you can imagine. We felt like we were slam dunked. And I'm trying to wrap my mind around this diagnosis. And so all I could think of was, okay, so you're telling me my daughter's going to die in a few weeks. Is she going to suffer in the process? And he looked at me. He didn't even say a word, and he just nodded yes. And I'm like, my gosh. And the ironic thing was Jackie was in the other room with the nurse. They had closed. It was like 6 o'clock. Their office was closed, but he was still with us. And the nurse was in the other room playing with Jackie. She was running circles in the other room with the nurse having fun. And so it was just shocking. We said, we're going to get a second opinion. He said, absolutely. So we got Michael Edwards. He's one of the top neurosurgeons in the world, ranked 1 or 2. He had offices in Sacramento and San Francisco. We were able to get in the next week. And he looked at everything and he said, I concur with the diagnosis, but he said, nobody has a crystal ball. We don't know how long she's going to live, but it is terminal. And so then we had to deal with that. It was a process. She went home on hospice and she was playing with her friends, little 5 and 6-year-old girls having tea parties. People were bringing stuffed animals over because she loves stuffed animals. Then she had like 20 of them. She started the Jackie Page stuffed animal store, and people would come in and she'd say, stuffed animal, you can have one. They're just $1. And she was selling her stuffed animals. It was so funny. And we had a monkey. I told you earlier, I had a pet monkey, but I had a friend who worked for animal things up in Sacramento, and they had a chimpanzee. They would rent animals out to movie theaters and do different things, birthday parties. And so he brought in a baby chimpanzee about 3 or 4 weeks before she died. And he played in our living room with Jackie. It was just beautiful. And she was still able to do those things. It really wasn't until the last couple of weeks. She went from running everywhere to walking to having to crawl to losing much of her speech. But the amazing thing was she never lost any cognitive ability. I was playing Color Me Elmo on video games 2 days before she died with her. So she never lost the cognitive ability, and she never really suffered. She never had headaches. She never had vomiting. She just little to no suffering. So he was wrong, and God was very gracious and merciful, but she did die in our arms 6 weeks after the diagnosis. That's how fast it went. And the crazy thing, Sandi, was that he told us when he diagnosed her, he said the tumor's so fast growing, it probably wasn't even in her brain 3 months before the diagnosis. That's how fast it was. But they've made huge advances in brain tumors and in children's brain tumors. But the problem was part of it was in her brain stem, and they can't touch that. And there's just nothing they could do. So that started my entry into the dark night of the soul. My wife, and as you know, many couples don't make it through that journey. A lot of times they break up even when there's a terminal illness, much less a death. But when the death happens, it's not as many as some people will tell you, 80%. It's not that high, but it is a high percentage. And we knew going into it. So I told my wife, I said, honey, we're in for a long road here. I said, I can't really help you that much because I'm on emotional and spiritual fumes, and so are you. So we're going to need to lean on our family and our church and our friends, but we're going to make a pact that we're not going to separate. We're not going to divorce no matter what happens. And we both did. And this October will be 40 years of marriage for us now.
Wow, congratulations.
This happened about 20 years ago with Jackie. So that's been amazing, God's grace through it. When she passed, again, it was in our arms, and you dread, you go through anticipatory grief. We knew she was going to die unless God did a miracle, and everybody was praying, and we were holding out for that. But then she just got worse, and then she slipped into a coma the night before, and she died on a Saturday at 9:30 a.m. And our other 2 kids, Joshua and Jessica, they were 9 and 7. Jackie was 5. And we had a downstairs part of our house, and they did not want to be there when their sister died. They knew she could at any time. So they were downstairs watching television, playing video games. So when she passed, we cried. We cried a lot. And Carrie, we had a neuro nurse named Janet who was there with us, who pronounced the time of death. And I went downstairs to tell the other two, and I said, Josh and Jess, turn the TV off, turn the video game off. I said, I just need to tell you, your sister just passed away, and she just went to be with the Lord. And I'll never forget, my son just looked down, and my daughter looked up at me, big brown eyes, and she just goes, Daddy, what are we going to do now? As if all hope is lost, you know? And I honestly didn't know what to say. But, I think the Bible shows us that the Holy Spirit would give us words to say when we don't know what to say. And I just said, I don't know, sweetie, but I know God's going to take care of us. And that's all she needed. And I find with kids, I know you work with kids. I find with kids, you only need to tell them what they need for the moment. You don't need to go into a long spiel and scenarios. When we brought her home from the hospital when she was diagnosed, we had friends and family we had friends from church, family who were there to meet us. And there were a lot of people, and we didn't know. We thought we'd be able to cut this out, and have surgery and she'd be okay. And we're praying. But my son, who was 9, he stopped me in the hallway and he goes, Dad, he goes, Jackie has a brain tumor, right? I said, yes, Josh. She goes, is she going to die? And that was right after she was diagnosed. And I said, I don't know, Josh, but she could. And he's like, okay. And he just, walked off. He was fine. He just needed to know. So I find that's really important. But that's how it all began, and that process. And I went immediately into grief counseling. Like within 2 weeks. I was only off work for 2 weeks from church. I should have stayed off longer looking back. But I went back, and then I started grief counseling. My wife did not. I got in a grief share group. We started a bunch of grief share groups. I didn't lead them. I was just in it. My wife kind of put it off and didn't really deal with the emotions till about 5 years later. Everybody deals differently. But I just jumped in, learned all that I could. Cried a lot. I never really had cried much before I lost my daughter. Taught as an athlete, played basketball in high school and college. Don't cry. Don't respond to the rest. Keep an even keel. Never saw my dad cry, and I just didn't cry. But after I lost Jackie, I couldn't help but cry. And I got to a point one time where I cried so hard over such a long period of time that at one point, I think my tear ducts dried up and I couldn't cry. And it freaked me out. And I've talked to other people who've had that happen. My friend who trained me, Rick Warren, kind of like a big brother to me, when his son died from suicide, Matthew, I asked him a few months after that, kind of went through that with him. And I said, did you ever get to a point where that happened? He goes, yeah, I did a few months in. And he said, but it came back the next day. And I talked to my counselor about it, and she said, don't worry, it'll come back. And it did, like a day or two later. So I still cry, Sandi, every now and then. I think about Jackie just about every day. Hardly a day goes by. And it's okay. I cry easily now. I'm not ashamed of it. It's just part of who I am now. So that's the story in a nutshell. I could tell you more, but that's the main part of the story.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that, Dave, and just the way that you speak about it. And there was just so many things that you shared that I think were so important. One being, I love when your son asked you the question, is she going to die? And you said, I don't know, but she could. And that is so important because children do better with honesty. You're right. You don't need to give them a whole bunch about this possibility or that possibility, but those honest answers are better. And I think sometimes parents, just in their desire to shield their children from things, which I understand, don't realize the confusion that can set in if they're not honest.
Yes. Yeah, it was important. And same with Jessica. She had a lot of questions. And people at church, everybody wants to know, everybody wanted to come over and visit, and we wanted to be open, but stay guarded too and protect her, And so that's kind of a hard tiptoe that you do, but we did. And it was great. And then there was a great outpouring. And I'll tell you another thing with children is how they grieve differently. So when she passed, it was a Saturday. My son was in a park and rec basketball league in Auburn that he played in, and he had a game that afternoon. And so, it came suddenly. She slipped in a coma and passed a few hours later. And so we were talking, me and my wife, and I said, well, let's just keep the kids here. Let's not go anywhere. The representatives from the mortuary are going to come and get her body. And I learned you don't have to call them right away. The neuro nurse said that. So my wife and her sister gave Jackie a bath, combed her hair, put on a favorite dress, and a few hours, and then we called them, and then took her out to the van, and that was, I'll tell you that, and then I'll come back to the basketball. And so when the guys got there, we had a house that was on up a little hill, our driveway, and you could park up there or park down at the bottom. They parked at the bottom with a van. So when it was time to go, they said, okay, we need to go. We'll bring the van up to the top here by your house. And I said, oh, no, guys, you don't need to do that. I said, I'll just carry her. She only weighs about 40, 50 pounds. She's 5 years old. I'll just carry her down to the van. And they said, okay. So I'm carrying her down to the van, and my wife's arms, in my arm, and I'm carrying her, and they open up the van doors, and I place her in the van, and they closed the van doors, and then they drove down our driveway, and they turned right on St. Andrew's Court, and then they turned left, and they disappeared. And we're just standing there looking like, where's our daughter? Our daughter just left. She's never coming back. And we started crying right there. And we probably stood there for 15 minutes. We were just kind of in shock, realizing we're not going to see her again. She's not coming home. She's not sleeping here tonight. And so I started having nightmares every night of seeing these two guys. One of them had a missing tooth. I remember that. And these two guys, and the doors closing and driving away with our daughter. And so every night I'd wake up and I'd have these nightmares. And I told my counselor that I was going to, as a Christian counselor, PhD from Fuller. And she said, well, Dave, I want you to reframe that. And she said, instead of seeing the men taking your daughter away, I want you to picture like angels descending from heaven and escorting your daughter to heaven that way. I met a guy named Jerry Sitzer. You've probably heard of. He wrote the book, A Grace Disguised. It's just an incredible book. After Jackie died, I called him. He's a professor at Whitworth University, and he'd lost 3 generations. It's a horrific story, but he came out of it the other end, and he loves God, and he loves his family, and he has a bounce in his step, an amazing guy. So I called him up, and I said, would you come and preach at our church and preach on help for hurting people and loss? And so he said, oh, I'd love to, Dave, but I'm a year, booked out in advance. And my PhD's in church history. I don't usually talk on this subject. I do sometimes. And I said, okay, well, I understand. Thank you so much. And we're about to hang up. And he said, now, when did your daughter die? And I said, 2 weeks ago. He goes, oh my gosh, I thought it was like 2 years ago. He goes, let me check with my kids, the ones he didn't lose. And he said, and if they're okay, I'll fly down there and do your weekend services in a week or two. And he checked and he called back and he did. So he does this amazing job. I got to spend time with him. I'm taking him back to the Sacramento airport Sunday afternoon. And he turns and he says, Dave, how are you really doing? And I said, well, I think okay. After just a few weeks of my daughter dying, I said, I'm really hurting, but I'm getting counseling. I got good support. And I said, but there's one thing that just keeps bothering me. He goes, what's that? I said, I keep having a nightmare, the same nightmare every night. And he said, and I told him about it and told him what the counselor said. And he said, how's that working for you? I said, it's not. I tried it. It's not working. And Sandi, I'll never forget what he said. He looks at me and he goes, Dave, that crap didn't work for me either. He said crap. He didn't say crap, but I'm keeping it G13. And he said, Dave, when the car hit our minivan at 80 miles an hour, he lost his wife, he lost his daughter, and he lost his mother. He said it was carnage. He said, I didn't write about it in the book, but it was carnage. My wife was still alive. I had to put a wrap my son. He had a broken femur. He would have bled out. And he said the paramedics didn't get there for an hour. So my wife died in my lap. My mom died, and my daughter was, killed on impact. And he said, you need to go back and relive that moment in your mind and see it. Sit down, pray before God, and feel that and embrace the pain. And so I went home after that, and I got alone, and I just prayed, God help me. And I just pictured those two guys coming again and closing the doors. And it was like I could feel that pain all over again. But I just said, I'm not going to run from it. It's like I embraced it. And I've never had those nightmares after that. It was a real breakthrough that was very counterintuitive, but I figured Jerry knew what he was talking about, and he did. And he talks about embracing pain, and grief ultimately is your friend. We don't look at it that way. I certainly didn't at the beginning. Now I treasure grief. I value grief. I think it's God's way of healing us from our pain, our trauma, our losses. It's God's way. We just need to feel the feelings as He's created us to do. So back to the basketball. I'm sorry.
Yes.
So the basketball. So she died. They come take her away. And I tell my wife, oh, Josh has a game in 2 hours. Well, he's not going to the game. He's going to stay here. And she goes, no, honey, he really wants to go to the game. I said, are you kidding? Jackie just died. He's not going to the game. She goes, honey, kids are different. He wants to go to the game. Let him go to the game. I said, okay. I said, but I'm not going. I'm not going. She goes, honey, you have to go. You're the coach. I said, well, honey, how can I do it? I'll be like a zombie watching these kids just thinking of Jackie. And I called my assistant coach. His name's Paul. He had a son on the team too. And I said, Paul, you're going to have to coach today. I can't coach today. And he said, why not? And I said, Jackie just died. He goes, what? I mean, again, he was in our church. He knew that they knew it was inevitable, but it went really fast. He goes, she died. I said, yes, today. And he goes, I'll coach. I said, I'll be no good. I'm just going to sit on the bench to support my son. And he coached, and we came home. And I learned that kids grieve totally different than adults. And it's not right or wrong. It's just he wanted to play basketball. And I think for him to be around his friends and, do something physical. But that was something I learned too.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, absolutely. Kids, you're right. Kids are so much different, and things kind of hit them at different times, and they often have different questions at different times, but not the same way as adults. And Dave, what you said about grief being a gift, grief is a gift. One time I was coaching a specialist, and she had done her thesis on grief and biblical grief. And the boilerplate for her is that grief is the process by which trauma, tragedy, painful experiences are transformed into hope and purpose and character. And if you circumvent the grief, you circumvent that process. And so you just end up carrying it.
Yes.
And I just thought that was so brilliant.
Yeah. And that's the key. It was the key for me, Sandi, was finding the purpose in my pain. I had all this pain. I didn't realize it. And I had 20 years before I wrote my book. It's called The School of Grief. But in the book, I found that pain and that rubble became kind of the foundation of what I do now. And it was transformed. And I think that's the beauty of the Christian faith. It isn't just overcoming pain. It's God redeems our pain, and He uses it to help other people. And we go through it. He didn't cause. I don't believe God caused my daughter's death. He's not the author of disease or cancer or anything like that. But He did allow it, and we all face different challenges. What Jim Collins calls cliffs, what Jesus called tribulations, and we all face them. And we all wish that everybody lived to 90 years old and died in their sleep. But the reality is, children die, babies die. And so going through that process and then coming out the other side and using it and turning it around and like you said, having God transform it and then redeem it, So, like, you've committed your life to helping people in their emotional health and wellness, and I've committed my life to helping grieving people find hope, meaning, and purpose after their loss, and help others.
Which is so beautiful. And I think what's so beautiful and powerful about your story too, Dave, it kind of reminds me of what we talk about even in grief recovery is I love what you said about I didn't used to cry, now I cry. But the way I experience you when you tear up or you cry is not that you're all burdened with all this pain anymore, but that you're connected to your heart. That when you talk about a sad moment, you're able to emote that sad moment versus it just kind of stuffing down. And I
Yes.
think that's what's so beautiful is I tell people when they go through grief recovery, welcome to your heart. You probably will end up feeling more because you're supposed to. God made us that way. But you're also a man of great joy. I've been around you. You have a lot of joy. You walk into a room and you light up with people. And I feel like you're a real testament to you went through this and it is so painful. And it changes life. I understand that. It changes it, but you're not in a place of burden now. Like you have faced and walked through, and you
Yes.
can see it. And I think that's where the hope is.
Yeah. And I think that's what we're trying to do, right? Is help people from that burden. One of the things I learned about grief is the original language is it's a weight. Bereavement is feeling robbed. I was robbed of my daughter, but grief can be a weight or a burden that people carry around. And you use that illustration in the grief recovery method. It's like if you had a backpack on, full of rocks or bricks, and you're carrying around that backpack. And we want to help you to get that off your back so you can live and be free. And it's so true about the grief and the burden. And I don't have that burden anymore. I feel that burden's gone. I still have times that are tough, and birthdays and anniversary and all that kind of stuff, but the burden is gone. There's great joy, and it's mixed. I used to think I was taught, a lot of people are taught that life's a series of hills and valleys, and you're down in the valley or you're on the top. When you're on top, everything's great. When you're down in the valley. But it was Kay Warren who taught me the railroad tracks analogy of, one track is disappointment, sorrow, and the other track is joy and happiness. And those two tracks go down parallel. We have both in our life, and we learn to live with both. But then the beautiful thing is, if you look at a train in the horizon of train tracks, then they end up going and merging into one.
Mm.
And that's where the sorrow track falls away. And that's now heaven when we get to heaven. And there's no more tears, there's no more grief. And now it's just joy and being with God and his people. So
That's so beautifully said, Dave, because again, I think you really, I mean, I feel like God has really chosen you for this role because you really do emulate what it means to go through a significant loss and not just either pretend like it didn't happen
right.
or, like you said, being stuck in the weight, but being able to be human, you're a dad. Jackie's your daughter. Of course, a birthday is going to feel, oh my goodness. I mean, even hearing this story, it's like, yeah, of course a birthday is going to hold those things at times. Of course, there's times you think of her and you smile, or times you think of her and sadness hits your heart. And I feel like you walk that really, really well. And I think that's important for people to understand. Grieving does not mean forgetting. Grieving does not mean I'll never be affected again. Releasing pain does not mean, oh, it's as if it never happened. It just means I don't carry the weight, but I'm still the person and I still carry that connection.
Yes. I think it's just the opposite. Grieving means remembering and honoring the life of your loved one. And I try and honor my daughter every day. And by helping other people, I'm honoring my daughter and her memory. Her life and her death changed my life. I didn't go into grief work. You didn't go into doing what you're doing by choice and say, oh, I want to do that. It's like it found us. God planned it. But I know, like you, I love what I do. I never would have been grieved dreamed I'd be a grief specialist, much less a pastor leading a grief community at our church. But that's what God had planned, and I absolutely love it. I love working with people in their deepest, darkest hour and helping them. And the idea of the faith element, a lot of people will say, well, if I really have faith, and the people will tell them this, like, if you really have faith, you don't need to cry. If you really have faith, you just need to, trust in the Lord. And it's like, God's our foundation, but He made us human. Jesus was 100% God and 100% man. He was fully human. Jesus wept. I think one of the best passages in the Bible on grief, and the best model is Jesus himself. He lost his friend Lazarus, and the Bible simply says Jesus wept. And such a good model for us. And the weep there, sometimes people think, oh, he probably just a little teared up. But in the Greek language in the New Testament, it's actually like a violent grieving, like a real tears that Jesus shed. And they said, look how much he loved Lazarus. And so I think that model, when you see God in human flesh grieving, how much more should we? So I tell people, I say, hey, if the Son of God needed a good cry, then maybe so do I. And then I tell them, and maybe so do you. So it really freed me up. And it's one thing when you cry on your own. And my counselor, right after Jackie died, said, if you feel self-conscious, I want you to yell. I want you to get this out, because if you don't get it out, it's still in there. So I would scream into a pillow, just scream. And I screamed, and Sandy, I made sounds I've never heard before, like guttural sounds, and that I've never had before or since. And I learned to cry, and crying is a catharsis. It cleanses your system. God knew what he was doing. And so it's a process, and Jesus really became my model for grief. A man's man who cried very deeply for the loss of his beloved friend Lazarus. So I try and share that with people and encourage them in that. It's harder, I think, for men. Not that's stereotypical, but men are taught that, I think, more than women, to not cry. So to let men know it's okay. It's good. It's part of your healing process.
Absolutely. I appreciate everything that you said. I've heard that many, many times, where even around a death, a believer will say, we just need to celebrate because they're in heaven. And I understand what they're saying. I really do. But I always tell people, death was not part of our original design. Like, we were originally designed for the garden. We were designed originally to just live with God. And it is because of the fall and because of sin entering the world that things like death are now a part of our experience, or, like you're saying, disease and all of the things like that God are not from God. They're from the fall. They're from the enemy. Things that maybe you're right, God may allow, and we never know quite what side, right? What side of the fence is it? Was that his will? Did he allow it? Well, we don't think it's his will, because his will was the garden. But I often tell people, if it's something outside of our garden experience, it's a loss to be grieved.
Yes.
So yes, we can know that we're going to once again be reunited with someone in heaven, but the separation is something that is a deep effect for our heart and our soul. And grieving, we need it in order to navigate this side of heaven.
Yeah, and I never knew longing, and the longing and the great hope that we have for a believer is that we will see our loved ones again. This isn't the end. It's, goodbye, but not forever. We're going to see them again. But the in-between time, there's such a longing, but also an anticipation. There's an excitement that this isn't it. This is temporary. We're going to see him again. It's okay. And yet being human, like you said, is being honest with who you are and how God's made you. Tears and grief are not a lack of faith. I think it's somehow, this is just my personal opinion, but I think it takes more faith to go through what we went through, and not bragging on us. Anybody who loses a dear one or child or a spouse or sibling, whatever, when they maybe have a terminal disease and they pray for healing, and then God doesn't heal them on this earth. He heals them ultimately by taking them to heaven to be with him forever, versus somebody else who has a miraculous healing, praise God. But which one requires more faith? I think it's the one who loses them, because so many people then feel like they just want to walk away from God. And he doesn't love me. He let this happen to me. And that comes into your mind. It did in mine. And I thought, what did I do wrong for my daughter to die? How did I screw up? God, forgive me. What did I do? And then after I went through this whole process, I thought, well, maybe it was my wife. Maybe she did something. And it just was not healthy thinking. And I just learned that no. And when I got down to the bottom line, I was hurting so bad. And I thought, well, if I turn away from God, where am I going to go? It's like Peter. And he said, are you going to turn away from me too? And Peter's like, no, you have the words of life. If you turn away from God at your deep, that's when you need him the most. The Bible says that the Lord is close to the brokenhearted, and he saves, he rescues those who are crushed in spirit. That's when I felt his presence, Sandi, probably more than any other time, was during the first few weeks and months of Jackie's loss. I felt, although I cried a lot, I was in deep sorrow, I felt he was right beside me. He was with me. And I still feel he's with me.
Wow. I so appreciate you sharing that also, Dave, about the relationship with God and the questions that can come into our mind, particularly when you've had a loss like this, right? Where you're saying, we were praying, so many people were praying,
Yes.
and then she died. And that, I love what you shared. Did I do something wrong? Wait, did my wife do something wrong? I love that you shared that, because I think that does come up for a lot of people. Now, I know for me, obviously my story is very different, but when I came to the realization of the things that happened to me as a child, I was a believer. I was a newer believer. I had just kind of come to terms with what had happened to me. And I had this time where I questioned God. Why did you let that happen? Why didn't you protect me as a child?
Well, I did that.
And I think it's not only is it really powerful to talk about that, but I think it's really healthy to do that. Like, you're bringing it to God. So did that happen for you, Dave?
Yeah. When she was diagnosed, Sandi, we were in a minivan, and now it's dark. It's in winter time, and we drove from Sacramento up to Auburn. It's about 20 minutes, and we stopped at a restaurant because it was dinner time. And my wife, we'd just been told our daughter's going to die, right? Mm-hmm. And my wife goes in to the restaurant with Jackie, and Jackie's laughing, having fun. And I said, she goes, aren't you coming in? I go, no, you go in. I need a few minutes, honey, to process. I need a few minutes. I'll be in a little bit. So I start driving the minivan in pouring rain around in circles, pounding on the steering wheel, saying, why, God? Why? Why is this happening? Why, Jackie? Why her? Take me, God. Take me. Spare her. Take me. God, why? And that some people will tell you, counselors, even pastors will say, well, why is not a good question? It's not. I think it's a great question when you're going through a season of trouble and turmoil and loss and confusion. You see it throughout the Bible. Tell David, he asks why in almost all of his Psalms, and he works through that. But I think why is a good question. And I didn't get an answer. And so after like 10 minutes of just weeping and crying and beating the steering wheel, I composed myself. I walked in the restaurant, and they're laughing. They're having dinner and they're laughing. And I said, oh, you're having a good time. And they're like, yeah. And Carrie goes, honey, Jackie has something she wants to tell you. You do. And I played along. Oh, you do, Jackie, what's that? And she said, well, Daddy, she said, I figured out how I'm going to stay young. And I said, oh, you did you? Well, just the back history. So when she was about 3, she would always say, I don't want to grow up. I always want to stay a kid. She would sit there in her lazy boy chair with her grilled cheese sandwich watching SpongeBob, and she just loved being a kid. I said, Jackie, you don't want to grow up? Nope, I want to be a kid, don't want to grow up. So then I asked her, I said, Jackie, don't you want to be a mama? Don't you want to be a mommy someday? And she said, no. And I said, why not? She goes, mommy's works too hard. I don't want to be a mommy. This is so funny. So with that background, and she'd say that, she said that a number of times over like a 2-year period. Now she's 5. She says, I figured out how I'm going to stay a kid. I said, oh, you have you? How are you going to do that, Jackie? She goes, I'm going to die young. Yeah. I looked at my wife. I was so angry. I said, what did you tell her? She didn't know about her diagnosis. She just thought she was sick. And she goes, honey, I didn't tell her anything. God showed her that. And God gave our daughter glimpses of heaven and mercy and showed her she had just received the Lord at 4. And she had, through Awanas, memorizing scripture, and I led her to the Lord, and she had a relationship with Jesus, and she was just okay. And it all culminated when we found out she was terminal. About a week later, she always wanted a hamster, and she loved hamsters. And we're not fans of rodents, especially in the house. And so we never got her a hamster. We had rabbits outside. We had a dog. We had pets, but not rodents. And so finally, after a week of a terminal illness, my wife and I talked. We said, she's always wanted a hamster. Let's just get a hamster. What the heck? They're telling us she's gonna die. Let's get her a hamster. She said, okay, that's great. Your job is to go with Jackie and let her pick out a hamster. So I drive down to Roseville, 20 minutes, the big pet store, because they had a little pet store in Auburn. And they had 12 hamsters, and she picked up, and she held every hamster in her hands. And then she picked one little hamster as a dwarf hamster, brown and white, and she named it Emily. And so I've never seen her smile so big. She's so happy. We go out to the car, we're driving back. It's a beautiful spring day, sunroof's open, and she's got little Emily, she's playing with it. And I'm driving, she turns and she goes, Daddy, when I get to heaven, will I get to see Grandpa? Her grandpa, my dad, died a year before that. And I said, yes, Jackie, when you get to heaven someday, you'll get to see Grandpa. She smiled. Another minute goes by. She turns. She goes, Daddy, when I get to heaven, will I get to see Jesus right away? I looked at her. I go, yes, Jackie, you'll get to see Jesus right away. And then another minute went by, and she goes, Daddy, and she holds up little Emily by the back of the neck. Daddy, when I go to heaven, can I take Emily with me? And I just thought, what in the world is going on here? And I honestly didn't know what to say. And I'm thinking, what is she thinking? What's God doing here? And I just said, I knew the theological answer, but I just said, yes, Jackie, we can arrange that, And she just smiled. And then I had to say it. I go, Jackie, you don't really think you're going to die, do you? And I'll never forget, Sandi. This is one of the most profound conversations I ever had. And God was just orchestrated. She looks at me with her hamster in her hand. She smiles and she says, silly daddy, we're all going to die someday. I'm like, oh my gosh. Wow. And she died 4 weeks after that. And she was looking forward to heaven. God was showing her she was going to go there. And it just kind of softened the blow for us and for her, just knowing that she was all right. And she was just really excited to see Jesus and see her grandpa who loved her to death. So that's a conversation I'll never forget that I love to share with people. And I wish my wife would have been a fly on the wall or a fly in the wall to hear it. But I told her about it, and Jackie talked about it openly, She talked about heaven openly.
I mean, that is amazing, Dave. It is amazing.
Yeah. He gave her a glimpse of heaven. And the Bible says in Ecclesiastes, Solomon said, God has put eternity in the heart of man. And we think of adults, but he's put eternity in the heart of kids too. And she had a real relationship with Jesus, and she was dying, and God used that to show her. And so I pictured her, our job as parents is to love our kids, protect our kids, and to raise them to follow the Lord and to hand them over to God someday. And we die first. We're supposed to die first, not them. And so she used to do this thing that was pretty amazing. She was very athletic. She played sports. She did ballerina. She was a dancer. And she could jump up on the counter in her kitchen. And she would do that, either jump up or pull herself up on the counter. And we'd play this game. The other two kids never did this, but you've seen kids do this. They get on the counter and you're standing and they jump to you. And sometimes you back up. She got to a point she could literally jump almost 4 feet in the air. I'd be back almost by the refrigerator and she'd just get in a crouch and take a flying leap. And I'd catch her. And we did that. Well, obviously, when she got sick, she couldn't do that. And she went from running to walking to crawling to where we had to pick her up. So one time she motioned for me to pick her up. She couldn't talk now, but she still could laugh and make sounds. And she pointed at the kitchen. So I picked her up. I set her on the kitchen counter and I went over to the refrigerator because she'd done it before and I thought she wanted something to eat. So I opened the refrigerator and I look at her and she's trying to stand up. And I thought, oh no, this isn't going to end well. She can't stand up. And I thought she obviously doesn't want something to eat. So I closed the refrigerator. I just watched her and I'm thinking, Jackie, don't do that. You can't stand up, sweetie. And she started trying to stand up. Her legs were wobbly, but every little muscle and tendon, she just willed it. And after about 10 seconds, she stood completely up. She's standing there completely erect, standing straight like that. And I just rushed over there because I thought she's going to try and jump, right? And she can't jump. And so I got like within 6 inches of her. And then she didn't say a word because she couldn't talk. She could make sounds. And she just goes with her hand. She goes, which means like, Daddy, back up. Because we'd do that before. She'd, Daddy, back up. And usually I'd take like 2 or 3 feet back. But I took like 6 inches back. And she did it again. She goes, and so I backed up another 6 inches. And then a few seconds later, she just fell. And I caught her and I hugged her and I kissed her little head. And she was laughing and I was laughing. I said, Jackie, Daddy's so proud of you. That was amazing. And I couldn't believe it was so courageous. And 2 weeks later, she died. But she got that last jump in. And that jump over time, as I thought about it and reflected on the courage it took to do that, if I was as little as, working out, doing bench press, and I couldn't get the last one, I would think of Jackie standing up and jumping in my arms. When I went for an MBA in my 40s, I thought of Jackie. I can't do it. Yes, I can. When I did my doctor of ministry in my 50s, I thought of Jackie. So she became like this power to me. And I know it's Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. But he gave me my daughter and infused me with this power. So I came up with a name. I call it Jackie Power. And so Jackie Power is that power when I think I can't do something, I tap into my Jackie Power and I do it. And I think everybody has Jackie Power in a different way. You have a power through something that's happened to you, an event, a person who came along and believed in you, helped you walk through that rocky terrain of trauma and grief, and we're stronger than we know we are. And God, we just have to tap into what God has provided for us, on our trail of loss and redemption. And it became a real redemption for me. So I'll always, that's a gift. That's the greatest gift I probably ever received in my life was Jackie Power.
My goodness. Just hearing you talk about her and talking about that time and all of the things that God did, and yet all of the anguish and pain, and yet her heart and her connection with Jesus it's so inspiring. Yeah. It is so inspiring. And I feel like it's inspiring even when it comes to, like you said, facing the pain and yes, being willing to walk through it, because God does so much through it. And yet I think because of that too, her memory it feels alive to me. When you talk about her, I can see her. I can see the kitchen counter. I can see her. I can see her standing up. I can see her laughing in the diner. Like I can see those moments. It feels very alive to me when you talk about it.
Yes. Well, you know about continuing bonds and how people, they used to a generation ago think that when a loved one died, you just had to move on and we're not going to talk about them and we're going to make this transition. And they've proven now that it's healthy to stay connected to them. I'll pray, God, give Jackie a hug in heaven for me today. I'll talk to my daughter. Not a weird thing, not a seance thing, but just a connection with my daughter. And it really helps me. So when I wrote my book, I talked about Jackie at the beginning, and I talked about, I said it's a love story between a father and a daughter and the loss of the daughter, and then trying to find meaning in it and purpose again. And I said, as I describe Jackie in the book, I'm not going to talk about her in the past tense. I'm going to talk about her in the present tense as if she's still here. I'm not delusional. I know she's not on this earth. She's not present, but I know she's alive. Romans says nothing can separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus. And she's with the Lord, and I'm going to see her again. So that really helps me, by staying in connection with her and talking with her. And people know when you are open to talking about a loved one that you lost, they become open to talking about it too. But they sometimes won't because they think, I don't want to say anything. It's going to hurt them. And it's like, no, we want to talk about them. We're proud of them. Talk about them. So I love that.
Beautifully said, Dave. Beautifully said. This whole conversation has just lifted my heart so much. I know it will for so many people. I want to ask you one final question, and that is for anybody listening who's maybe gone through a tremendous loss, whether it is they lost a loved one or another loss, and maybe they're in pain or they're not sure what to do about the pain. What would you say to that person?
I would say first, realize you're not alone. The tendency is to think we're alone. And somebody told me a mentor at my church, an elder in my church, he had lost his daughter in a car accident when she was 21. And they didn't have other children. We had two others. And when Jackie died, he said, Dave, you can't get through this alone. You need God first and foremost, but you need other people to come alongside you. So I would say reach out. Don't isolate yourself. Reach out for help. It could be just a friend. It could be a counselor, it could be a pastor, it could be a therapist, but reach out and know that it's going to take time. Don't beat yourself up. Be kind to yourself. Treat yourself like you would treat a best friend. Be generous with grace and mercy toward yourself in the grieving process, because it is a painful process, and it's easy to beat ourselves up and think, oh, I'm not grieving the right way. I'm not grieving good enough, and it's not about that. Everybody grieves different. It's about honoring our grief and allowing ourselves to feel the feelings that God gave us to feel, and it's different for every person.
Beautifully said, Dave. Beautifully said. Now, let me ask, I know you have your role at Shepherd, and do you also work with people individually in addition? Like, is there a way for people to contact you?
Yeah. They can contact me. Probably the best way, easiest to remember is Pastor Dave, Pastor Dave.com, PastorDave.com. And I've done group counseling, I've done individual counseling, grief counseling, coaching. I do retreats, I do workshops about every quarter at our church. They're free. I do grief workshops here at Shepherd Church. I do online workshops. So I do a lot of that. And I'm also part of it kind of goes hand in hand. I didn't know it until, later on I knew it went hand in hand, but I didn't know how valuable it is. I'm also a funeral celebrant. So I do all this stuff with grief, but I also do celebration of life services. And a lot of times that's where I'll first come into the contact with somebody. They seek me out because of the work I do in that field. And then as a result, I'm able to come alongside them and help them with their grief as we're working on preparing a beautiful personalized memorial service for their loved one. So those two things go hand in hand. And I love doing that. I've worked with Forest Lawn doing funerals there as a celebrant, as a clergy member. And we do a lot at our church. I do them on the side, but that's my main thing I do. I love doing it.
That's wonderful. Well, I'm going to tag that website below so that people that want to connect with you are able to do that. And I just want to say from my heart to yours, thank you for today. This was absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much, Dave.
Thank you for having me, Sandi. Keep doing what you're doing. It's really impactful.
Thank you.